Ladies and gentlemen, presenting the next session. This session is titled Measuring Growth and Success, Time to Move Beyond GDP. This session is brought to you by New India Assurance and RBL Bank. Our panelists for the session are Mr. Subramanian Rangan, Professor INSEAD. Can we have a round of applause for sir? Dr. Amit Kapoor, President and CEO, India Council of Competitiveness. We can continue with the round of applause. And of course, this session is moderated by Ms. Shereen Bhan, Managing Editor, CNBC TV 18. Welcome, sir. Welcome, ma'am. There you have Dr. Amit Kapoor. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, what we're going to be discussing today is whether it's time now for us to move beyond looking at just the GDP number as a measure of our success and a measure of our growth. Every time we put out the GDP print, whether it's 7.6% or 7.1%, which is what the current number is, it gives us a sense of where we stand in the world. It gives us a sense of how much has been achieved, but it also perhaps cloaks how much more needs to be done. I think there is a debate on globally at this point in time on whether merely looking at the GDP number is enough, and especially for emerging markets and developing markets like India, whether merely looking at the GDP number is enough, and whether that lulls us into a sense of complacency. It also perhaps pushes away the government from looking at things that ought to be prioritized. So let me take that conversation forward. And we've got with us, as the moderator pointed out a short while ago, our panel here. Let me start by asking you, and this is a global debate that's currently underway on whether, the GDP cloaks more than it actually tells us about, and especially when we talk about countries like India, whether it's 7.1%, 7.6%, or 8% plus, which is the aspiration at this point in time, does it mask the somewhat ugly underbelly? I'll just throw some data for the benefit of our audience. 2016 data, International Food Policy Research Institute ranked India 97 out of 118 countries on the Global Hunger Index. That's a lower score than other developing countries. In fact, China, the strongest competition to India, not only features in the top 30 countries in the Global Hunger Index, but it's also the world's second largest economy. So is there a need for us to start to measure our growth beyond just GDP?
I want to maybe start with a little story. A couple of weeks ago, my wife and I were visiting our son in Denmark. He's a student studying this semester in Copenhagen. And Denmark shows up as one of the countries that seems to do well in all these alternative indices. Now, there are 2 points to the story. One, every time I visited a Nordic country, whether it was Denmark or Norway or Sweden, it does make you wonder why. Why would these countries seem to be doing well, not only on the economic side, but on other sides? And I've come to realize it's not easy to figure that out. So we do understand that we may care about many things, and some of the countries seem to have some of those things we would want to care about, but it's not an easy answer. The other thing I realized during this trip, Shereen, is, we spent time the weekend, and I, in fact, I have 2 kids, and I value my time with my kids. They're both quite old and university. Somebody said, money may be the currency of the economy, but time is the currency of life. And time is just not part of this GDP. And in a country like India, maybe we have already known this. This is why yoga and meditation and so on is now spreading to the West. So a long way to address your question. I have maybe 2 observations more to share with you as an opening observation. one of the, GDP existed in the maybe, let's say, 100 years. Governments have existed long before. And one of the roles of government is coordinating. It's a leadership role. What is one of the first things that a leader has to do? One of the first things I think a leader should do is frame an aspiration. If you can, somebody said, what's the most important question in life? Is your ladder against the right wall? We're all climbing some ladder, and if it's not against the right wall, and so asking this question about is GDP the right wall, I think is an important and a very fundamental question.
I want to pick up on this observation that you make, that it's important to identify an aspiration, and that, in a sense, can pretty much lay out the direction of government policy, can lay out the direction in terms of government priority. The aspiration broadly, and I don't think we've sort of spelt it out in any clear, explicit way, but the aspiration when we talk about India, or the narrative that we hear when the government talks about India, is we want to be the world's fastest growing economy. We want to be a double-digit growth economy. Do you believe that that is the right aspiration for India today?
So, if you think about that, there's a couple of basic things. One is a dignified existence. A dignified existence means not having to worry about water, a toilet, maybe electricity. And I think focusing on GDP or economic growth is one proven path to addressing some of these things. It's, of course, not the entire way in which this is going to be had. So let me make the second point. If I had an aspiration, it would be something like, for society and for the humans in that society. My aspiration for society would be fairness. The standard of a society, maybe the standard of an economy is efficiency, but the standard of a society is fairness. Is this a fair society? And there are three elements in this: the Gini coefficient, the gender coefficient, and the generational coefficient. The generational has to do with climate change and environmental issues. The gender issue is about the treatment of women and the status and standing and participation and emancipation of women. And the Gini has to do with the distribution. So that's the thing about a fair society. And then for the human beings in that society, what we want is well-being. Well-being, as Bhutan says, not only for the body, but also for the mind and the spirit. And this is, the GDP is more emphasizing the body. And it's about output and it's about consumption, which is fantastic, but it doesn't really take into account the environment, nor does it. So, if you ask me, is that good for India to pursue a high growth, let's say, enabling set of economic policies, including on technology, as we just heard? Absolutely. These are not substitutes, but we know that, it's a plurality, it's not a singularity. Life is, variety, and we need some income, but we need more than income.
Sure.
And
you're absolutely right. In order for us to be able to meet the objectives of positioning ourselves as a fair society, of being able to achieve some of the issues that you talked about, better gender parity, dealing with some of the environment-related issues. I mean, India is home to 10 of the most polluted cities in the world today. I think growth is an answer to being able to provide for that, but I think in terms of prioritizing some of those issues, it requires a different approach and perhaps a different prescription. But Amit, let me ask you this, and since we're talking about how do we actually ensure that it's not just growth, that we grow at perhaps double digit or high single digits, but it comes with equity, it comes with gender parity, it comes with environmental consciousness, it comes with social consciousness, growth with a conscience. How do you ensure that?
This is a very important question in terms of what we are grappling with. One of the issues that you're saying is GDP the right matrix for understanding growth of economies. I fundamentally believe that GDP is just an output number. It does not really talk about social outcomes at all. So we need to find solutions, or we need to find metrics which is able to look at the outcomes as to what society is actually going through. So if I really talk about a news item that appeared yesterday in terms of India having the largest number of poor in the world, so that means there is a certain issue that we're actually looking at. When we talk about polluted cities, that means we are breathing the worst air possible that we're actually living in. So how do we actually grapple with these issues? So what needs to be done is that we need to actually look at a matrix, or we need to actually look at an indicator or a set of indicators which reflect the reality of the world, rather than just looking at a measure like GDP, which was done by Kuznets in about 80 years back. It has outlived its life. So what we need to do here is that we need to actually look at something like a social progress or a consolidated view to the world. In fact, what the professor was saying, I'll probably go a step ahead in terms of saying that, okay, you talk about gender parity, you talk about happiness, but there are three fundamental things which I believe matter for the world. And what are those three fundamental things? The three fundamental things are, one, are the basic human needs. Like, am I able to fulfill the basic needs that I require? Which would be, say, nutrition, health, so on and so forth. The next thing would be the foundations for well-being. Is it something that I'm doing in terms of creating the opportunity for all? Is it something that wherein I'm able to push forward the economy itself? Am I able to give access to people on various sets of information and so on and so forth? And the third thing would be opportunity at the end of the day. And when I say opportunity, it would include issues like tolerance. It'll include issues like inclusion in terms of how we are really looking at things. It's about like the non-religious divide that actually exists within the country. We are all equals per se. If I'm able to look at these measures, then yes, we are able to answer something. We have to really move on. And this becomes a fairly strong imperative in terms of taking huge sets of policy decisions as well. And this is the step forward. This is the first step that needs to be taken.
You know, we had the idea or the thought of an outcome budget. It's, you know, the budget is much talked about in India, and it gives you a sense of how much money is going where and what the government is spending on. But that perhaps will not entirely capture the matrix that Amit wants us to put in place. Because when you talk about the fact that there's actually been a decline in the number of women participating in the workforce in urban India and rural India, even as India has grown economically and has emerged as one of the world's fastest growing economies, that data or that reality somehow doesn't get captured or doesn't get talked about, and perhaps because it doesn't get talked about or captured enough, doesn't get prioritized by the government. How do we ensure that there is an alignment there?
So this is one of the big challenges as to why GDP is being revisited by every national government around the world. And the issue of, especially when it comes to government, Amit mentioned the difference between output and outcome, and Shereen is mentioning the difference between input and outcome. Now it's even worse. So in healthcare, generally people measure spending, but we don't know whether we got health. In the United States, people say we have actually disease management. This is not the Department of Health, this is the Department of Disease, 18% of GDP. So you're quite right that one way is with this big data. So today we are able to actually see, and we are able to maybe sample in multiple ways what kind of quality of life do people have, and what kind of educational outcomes they experience, what kind of safety do they experience. Some part of this, for the first time, is being self-reported. Now, this is, so you can look at, for example, people look at the content analysis on, I'm not a social media person, but people look at content analysis on Facebook. What kind of words are trending? Is the country happy? Is the country angry? Is this more feminine, more, you know, so we can start to get to how we feel. It cannot just be about the numbers. It's not just what counts, it's what matters. And what matters is very much our emotions, our feelings, our energy. We may, with the data, if we wanted to, start to get snapshots of that, complement that with self-reports, asking people, are you satisfied? I was reading, and I don't know, Amit, whether you saw this, MasterCard apparently did a study just now in Asia on happiness. And India is by far the most happy country, including beating China, beating Singapore, Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, etc., etc. on all, there were about 4 dimensions to this. So self-reports, you know, you look at that and you say, wow, this is a reflection of India. And maybe, you know, Amartya Sen was right. It's a country of contradictions. Everything that is true, the opposite is also true. And, you know, but we do. So I think the most important things in life are not easy to measure. Friendship, trust, love. We don't measure these things. We develop them, we invest in them, and then we hope that, you know, I have no regrets. And so maybe this measurement thing will get better. I think it is getting better. And will continue to do so with big data and with real-time feedback. And that feedback will set us on a good path. I think as the previous panel that you moderated just said, we are on a good path. I'm so proud to be Indian. Yeah, I've lived outside for 40 years now, but I come quite frequently, and of course, it's impossible not to follow what's happening in India. And listening to the panel previously, there is no first best. If we can avoid third best and get to second best, we are well on our way. And that's the human condition. We're not going to have it all at the same time, but eventually we may have it all, and sometimes we may even have it all.
Well, sometimes, hopefully, we will have it all, and you know, that's the constant sort of refrain that women are usually having to deal with. But Amit, you know, you do a lot of work around competitiveness, and when we talk about, for instance, our aspiration to position India as a manufacturing hub, what do we actually need to do to make sure that, you know, whether it's domestic or it's FDI, comes into India from a manufacturing perspective? And when people start to think that way, then it's like, okay, what happens as far as wages are concerned? You know, how can we be the low-cost manufacturing hub? That's a position that's already been taken by China, but they've seen a significant wage increase. So, you know, can there be an opportunity there for India? But then when you start to tie all of these things up, how does it then fit when we start to measure how happy we are, when it starts to measure with the social outcomes that we want to achieve? How do we make sure that our aspiration of being a manufacturing hub is one that is built on the principles of fairness, of equity?
Yeah, this is a great question, you know, like there are 3 things that we are really talking about in the same breath. And I would take you back to the work that we are doing with Niti Aayog right now. We are coming out with a new index on social progress. So if you really look at this whole thing in terms of like competitiveness per se, and what drives competitiveness, it's going to be in terms of like how do I attract investments and so on and so forth. The biggest question is going to be whether we have the infrastructure or not, and whether we actually have the right labor, the right wages and things. And it's been spoken at length in many ways. But what we are really seeing here is that when you talk about economic outcomes or GDP outcomes or per capita GDP, what we are seeing is that the social progress per se, there is a definitive correlation that we actually see. What we are seeing right now is that the burden of growth within the country is happening within 6 or 7 states right now. And that's a very well-known fact. And that is exactly where we are seeing that social outcomes are also better. So that means people end up asking for more. They actually start worrying about the quality of life as they go along. So this is where we are actually seeing that when you talk about social progress per se and the index that we are developing, and we are trying to do it on a longitudinal basis, and there is a very strong correlation that we see that as and when the competitiveness of a state has improved, from a general point of view or even manufacturing competitiveness, we are seeing that the social progress is also rising. So what you're seeing is that city-states do well in a certain way. You see the state of Delhi or the city of Delhi, the state of Goa, which are more like urban agglomerations, they're actually seeing a huge positive impact. But then we are actually seeing absolutely abysmal set of numbers coming from UP or Bihar. So the traditional states which are actually having non-performance has been the categorization or whatever, they are seeing huge negatives per se. So the challenge here is going to be in terms of like, how do I actually make UP more competitive? How do I actually improve the social outcomes? And if I want to improve UP, it is going to be imperative that we actually start pushing the system in terms of getting into either manufacturing, understand the local clusters there. I think we have absolute lack of understanding as to what industries can do well where. What we are seeing today is that every state, for that matter, You go to Karnataka or you go to any other state, they would actually want to say that we want to do all the 14 things, all the things. No, that's not true. You have to just pick up 3 or 4 big things and start focusing on it. You look at the local clusters, and then things will start happening. And then it will start improving the social outcomes as well, because that improves wages, that improves the quality of life, that improves the industry infrastructure, the value chain, the development of clusters. If you really talk about Bihar per se, the Bhagalpur cluster, the silk cluster has always been an amazing place in terms of the quality of products, but we have not been able to do anything with it. Of course, there is severe lack of political will there, and I think it's absolutely, I think we need to just have a much more visionary idea around it and then really move ahead. So our social outcomes are going to be important, and that's what we should look at in the Social Progress Index, as we are saying. On the Social Progress Index, India is ranked 98th right now. It was ranked 101 a year back. So what it means is that as an aggregate, there are severe issues that we are seeing in terms of women's safety itself. You'll be surprised to know that India has become much more unsafe for women in the last 5 years. Even the educational outcomes have become worse off in the last 5 years. So what we need to do is that this tells us that if we don't get things right, whatever we have been vouching for actually will go down.
And it also tells us that growth doesn't necessarily guarantee better performance as far as social indicators are concerned, because this was a period where India has emerged as one of the fastest growing economies in the world. We've been growing at 7% plus, and yet we find ourselves 98 on the Global Social Parameters Index.
Yes, so you know, like, this is a very important aspect as well. If you go to the Gini coefficient, this actually gives me a very important indicator in terms of the disparity that exists out here. Huge levels of disparity. Recently, Oxfam came out with a very interesting study that the top 10 families control wealth which is equivalent to the bottom 400 million people. So that means even the capitalistic model that we are really talking about is deeply skewed. What we have seen is the accumulation of wealth at the top end is fairly high. So there is that bottom 200 million, 300 million people who are not really getting touched by that growth itself. So how do we solve that? We need to just, and in terms of the Social Progress Index, we will only get it right when we are able to create the right set of opportunities. I think the government has taken some amazing steps for it in terms of, say, the Startup India campaign, the financial inclusion aspect, knowledge being there, or information asymmetry getting reduced. So the basic steps are being taken. It's only going to be about some time when things start shaping up. But I think it's too early to say that it's going to happen very soon. We're still about 5 years or 10 years away from the results to really come out in a very strong manner.
Can I just add something on that?
Yeah.
I think also on the previous, one of the sessions, either the one you just did or the previous one, there was a discussion about the narrative. And one thing that I realized is ideas matter. And ideas are usually articulated through the use of some vocabulary, some kind of slogan. And I think we've struggled with how do we convey this, and I've certainly struggled with how do we convey that we want growth, but we want this growth to be fair, and we want it to be more than just standard average growth, right? And the average and the median is already very different. So the way I think about it, Shereen, is I think about integrating growth. Germany has had integrating growth. Switzerland has had integrating growth. Norway. Now, maybe some of the Gulf countries with oil, Norway has oil, and I wondered, why do the Gulf countries, when they have oil, or Russia, why is it not integrating? And what does integrating mean? So there are 3 things I think of in terms of integration. One is market and society. A second is present and the future. So Norway exports oil, but it's very, very environmentally sensitive. And the third is capital and labor. And in all of these societies, if there is one thing I observed from Germany to Norway, it is that they have not left behind labor. They have in fact shared the surplus. And that's the same thing that's going to happen with technology. If we do not choose integrative growth, that we will integrate the future, society, and labor as we grow. And that means capitalists, which means business people, are really the ones who can generate not only growth, but integrative growth. Government can just provide the oxygen and maybe the aspiration, but they can't really do this. And that's what the businesses, you know, Sweden has a lot of businesses. They're very high tech and they're very entrepreneurial, but they're integrative in the way they've approached it. And yes, the stock market is not as high as it might be in some other countries where the returns to productivity go to capital excessively. And then we end up with inequality, and then we end up with taxation, then we end up with black money, then we end up with I mean, it's a vicious cycle.
You know, just to take that point forward, and Amit talked about it, and you just took that point forward. What does capitalism need to do, and specifically in the Indian context? I mean, we had the government make it mandatory for companies to spend 2% of their profits on corporate social responsibility. Now, I'm not necessarily sure that that's the right approach, but how do you ensure that capitalism starts to work for everybody? You talked about, you know, stock market returns, and yes, you know, shareholders care about where the money is being used, how it's being spent. Not all capital is patient capital, so, you know, you will have to think about returns on investment. But the fact that in the context that we are in India, what is the role and responsibility of capitalism for the future?
I think there are many ways to address it, but a couple of points come to my mind immediately. One is what Indra Nooyi taught me. Indra Nooyi, as you know, she says CSR, the 2%, this is about how you spend money. She says if we want to improve capitalism, you've got to reflect on how you make money.
The money, yeah.
And I think that's really, really important. And the other thing is, you know, Mr. Kant talked about, he's all about performance. I'm a strategy professor in a business school called INSEAD. And I tell my students, you know, unless we have performance and progress, we're going to end up with distrust of capitalism, and therefore with more regulation, and therefore with less growth, and therefore with more corruption and lobbying. And we know this, so I'm telling my students, the INSEAD MBA is not a master's in business administration. That generation is when I got my MBA. I said, your generation, MBA means masters in better alternatives. And it's hard work, and you've got to think about it. But it can be done if you want to do it. We're so smart, we can send so many satellites all at once. Surely we can figure these things out.
Well, that's a great idea. You know, and I think that the MBA, as it's practiced, taught, perpetuated, absolutely, and ripe for disruption. But Amit, you just want to take that point forward on what capitalism needs to do to ensure that it stays relevant in the future.
You know, it's a fairly large debate that we are really looking at. One thing that what the professor said was, and I'll put it in a very interesting word, like it's about inherited prosperity or created prosperity. So when you actually play on resources, that is like your land resources or whatever, we're just talking about inherited prosperity. That is where the challenge of economic development comes, because wealth creation or wealth distribution will always happen when you do created prosperity in terms of creating business models around it. The second thing is that you talk about economic objectives and social objectives. There is definitely no doubt that the world will actually see a huge convergence of economic and social objectives. If we don't get it right, I think the kind of resentment that people will have and the kind of pushback that we'll have would have never been seen by humanity at all. So if you really look at it, what needs to be done is that the capitalistic models that we are really talking about, the way we create wealth, what we would call as a shared value. So creating shared value is going to be the very next paradigm of capitalism or business models that we are talking about. I think it's the models like Nestle are going to be passé. And the models like what you call as Mother Dairy are going to be the models of the future, wherein 83% of the revenues are actually going back to the farmers. And they actually make money out of it. So what we are seeing is a huge emergence of models or social models which incorporate or imbibe the principles of distribution in an equitable way. And they actually they are not exploitative models. And that's what is going to work for the future. So I think capitalism has to say that it is not going, it's about equal competition, equal opportunity. We need to create that. Otherwise, we are actually going to be seeing what I call as the Trumpization of the world. And that's a very dangerous thing to actually happen. People are just hiding behind, or they're just really saying that I'm going to be very cagey. So when you talk about a globalized world, it's going to be more about access, more about things, more about models which include people, rather than just exploit them and just see them as markets. They're individuals and who have to be respected.
Yeah, I think that last point is the one that is critical, is to stop seeing people merely as consumers of your products or your services, and to stop seeing constituencies that you address as only addressable markets. I think that is something that we need to take cognizance of within the business community. Anyone here with questions for our panel? Yes, you've raised your hand right at the back. So if you can stand up, please, we'll try and get you a microphone.
I've got a couple of very critical points to make. GDP is all about a quantifiable approach, nothing to do with quality. It doesn't tell you about the quality of growth. Second, a couple of years ago, maybe 15 years ago, the International Herald Tribune carried an article which said, most of the theories of macroeconomics, from Adam Smith to Milton Friedman, were conceptualized with a colonial Europe in mind, growing at anemic growths of 1.5%, 2%. With two countries, 2.5 billion people, in India and China, growing at 10% plus simultaneously, you need radically different frameworks and yardsticks to understand what's happening. Number three, as far as quality is concerned, I'll give you an example. Yesterday or day before, Sonu Nigam said, Azan loudspeakers harm his sleep. I'll give an example to contrast it. Some of the Nordic countries don't allow toilets to flush toilets in the restroom after 10 in the night. That's for noise pollution. So think about these things. India is doing a lot as far as growth is concerned. I'm very sorry to say, trying to portray India as the fastest growing major economy in the world is a huge mistake. You're growing at the fastest rate by default. When it was your time to grow in the 80s, 90s, and the last 3 decades, you failed. Southeast Asian tigers and China went up, and the consequence is there for all to see. China's foreign exchange reserves are $3 trillion.
Sure.
They've got huge number of sovereign wealth funds buying assets all over the world.
By the way,
where is India's sovereign wealth fund?
We agree with you, by the way. So I wish we had somebody here from the government to perhaps try and respond to that, but we're in agreement with what you're saying. I think we started the panel by saying that the way that we measure our success or our growth cloaks a lot of the stuff that actually needs to be addressed, and it doesn't tell us the entire story, and some parts of the story we won't like. So we're in complete agreement with you, sir. But let me get both our panelists here to quickly comment on the points that you're making. He's echoing what we've been saying through the course of the panel.
I mean, I think all these comparisons, you'll always find somebody who is doing better and somebody who's doing worse. I think, you have to have the distance, right? The Dalai Lama talks about engaged detachment or detached engagement. You have to be engaged, but you also have to be detached. If you get worked up with China's reserves, then you should go and, I want to say live in China, but really, I mean, there are so many things that I don't like about China. What about all those things? So we can't, life is a plurality, and I think India is on a good path. Of course, it could have done much better.
Yeah.
So could so many other countries in the world.
Yeah, the question is what are we doing about the way that we progress in the future? What direction are we taking? Yes, Amit, you want to respond?
It's something very interesting. One, just to say that there's nothing right with India is absolutely wrong.
Yeah.
I think there is so much happening here. There is so much opportunity that we are actually sitting on. If there is a country of the future, then I would always say it is going to be India. The newer set of models that are going to get created here. So it's a great opportunity. Of course, there are some blemishes, there are some negatives, there would be the largest number of poor or whatever. But we just cannot say that everything's wrong here. You have seen enterprises getting created here, you have seen positives, you have seen everything happen around, so that's where it is. So we need to look at the positive aspect. And you made a very interesting point on that Azan thing or whatever. I must actually tell you, and you were talking about Nordic countries not doing something. I must tell you that I'm an atheist per se. I just do not believe in the concept of God, because I find that it is a fairly futile effort that happened about 12,000 years back at the beginning of the intellectual revolution. And we have to move ahead with it. So I think it's about trying to say that let's be more, accepting to various sets of things. And that's where it is. And if we become more accepting, everything else will become part of the story. I think it's not about criticism. Your belief and my belief could be very different, but we just need to accept it and let it be. Okay, now if there is something like noisy or whatever, request them, and everything will actually change. I think it happens in the temples as well. It's not only the mosques, and that's how it is. Let's be more tolerant in any country for that matter. Even the Prime Minister has ended up saying, it's tolerance which is going to drive growth. There is a very important work that we did on creative economy of India. And it says that technology, tolerance, and talent drives growth of countries and locations. Bombay is tolerant, that is why what it is. Bangalore is tolerant, that is why what it is. So if you want to understand, if you want to see growth happen, let's be more tolerant to ideas, more respectful for each other, and that's what's going to happen.
So marry sensibility with sensitivity. I think that's the key that we're the message that we're sending from the panel. Yes, sir, go ahead. We've got about 2 minutes before we close.
Thank you very much. My name is Rajiv Khurana. Prime Minister Modi talked about P2, G2, pro-poor and good governance. Keeping that in mind, when do we think we can grow out of subsidies and actually move towards true enablement to increase a good quality of life for individual and not just creating averages for the nation?
Yeah. Amit, you want to take that?
You know, like what we are saying is, or hinting at, is a new model of a capitalistic system. Can we look at a Gandhian way of thinking? I always ask that question, that the Gandhian way would be, can I actually make my villages resilient?
Yeah.
Can I actually make them self-sufficient economic engines? If I'm able to do that, if I'm able to go back to that simple idea, I think we are able to do too many things, and we are actually talking about better outcomes over a period of time. So when you talk about this, I think this is definitively possible. And the second question on subsidies, I think we are seeing a lot of change that is happening right now. There is much more targeted subsidy and everything that's happening. But I think in a country like India, I think the burden of taxes is just on about 2 or 3%. So the challenge, it seems like there is too much that is being taken out of 2 or 3%. But now there is also another challenge. Like 70% of India lives at less than $5 a day. Let's respect that as well. We are a country which is fairly poor per se, with very rich sets of people. We need to find a solution which can actually solve that problem. Right now, subsidy is the problem. If we have a better solution, I think the government and people around in the government would actually look at it. The third point was on governance. I think government is trying to do something very interesting. What India needs is huge shift in the governance mechanism. What I call is the all India services. So the last demonic relic of the Raj called the civil services will have to get dismantled in many ways. And we'll have to see something much more different coming up.
So disruption of the civil services is the idea that we would like to end this conversation on, but it's been an absolute pleasure.
Can
yes,
I
please,
make
please.
one comment? So if I wanted to leave you with one thought, please think about this. GDP to well-being, that's for the economy or society. At the level of enterprises, and many of you are entrepreneurs, please think not only of performance, think of performance and progress. Progress does not come from Delhi. Progress comes in the towns, in the villages, and especially in the businesses. And if you're not making life flexible for women to work, or if you're not training young people with apprenticeships, India is going to have the same challenges, regardless of whether it is NITI or whether it is a planning commission. So from GDP to well-being, performance to performance and progress, and at the individual level, rather than focusing only on income, let's please also focus on impact. Thank you.
Well, I think that is the perfect ending. Amit and Professor, thanks very, very much. Performance along with progress, income and impact. I think that is what we should be striving at, both from a point of view of the government as well as India Inc. And of course, we hope that those messages are taken forward by some of you who have joined us here this afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us here and for that great discussion. Thanks very much indeed.
A big thank you to our panelists. I request you all to please be seated. We're going to start with the polling. So whatever the discussion was, we can have a much bigger round of applause. Come on. This was truly a very interesting conversation. Right, so ladies and gentlemen, mobile phones on the table and your voting pads in your hand. The question is, Human Development Index should be a measure of development in addition to GDP. Those who agree, please press A. Those who disagree, press B. Those who are neutral, press C. And if you can't say, press D. Please be sure when you press your option, do press OK which is located right at the extreme top end. "15 seconds is the time, and let's see the polling. Oh, there you go. Previous question, it was 89%, now 85%, so massive. So can we have a round of applause for very good polling? Now I would request Vice President, Dassault Systems, Mr. Chandan Chaudhary, to kindly grace the stage and present mementos to our esteemed group of panelists. Can we have a round of applause for Mr. Chaudhary? First and foremost, ladies first, once again, Ms. Shereen Bhan. Up next, Mr. Subramanian Rangan. And then we have Dr. Amit Kapoor. A big hearty thank you to all our esteemed group of panelists for taking out their precious time and being a part of this summit. All right, ladies and gentlemen, on your table, if you see, there is a special feedback form. In case you haven't got, you can come up to us or just raise your hand. We'll drop it soon on your table. Each table, each person has a feedback form. It's a humble request to please fill it up so that our staff can come and collect it again. We break for tea and coffee. It's a 15-minute break. So during that time, with a sip of tea and coffee, refresh yourself and do fill in the feedback form. And if you haven't put in your business card in